I moved to Elkins in 2016 for a job that I needed, and a landscape that I wanted. D and the two have kept me in Randolph County for 8 years now, the job paying the bills and the mountains paying everything else. I hike the Monongahela 3 or 4 times a week, more in summer when the days are long enough to get a solid loop in after work, less in winter when the light fails early, and the trails at elevation are ice and mud, and the particular kind of misery that West Virginia winters inflict on anyone foolish enough to walk uphill in them. I'm not a casual hiker. I don't walk for exercise or for photographs or for the kind of performative outdoor experience that social media has turned into its own industry. I walk because the forest is the only place where my mind stops producing the low-grade anxiety that it produces everywhere else. The only environment where the noise in my head goes quiet, and the world becomes what it actually is, rather than what I'm afraid it might become. The trail is a loop in the Otter Creek Wilderness, about 20 miles east of Elkins, a 9-mile circuit that climbs from a creek bottom to a ridgeline, follows the ridge south, and descends through switchbacks back to the creek, which you follow north to the trailhead. I've done this loop at least 30 times. I could walk it blindfolded, and on some mornings when the fog is thick enough to reduce visibility to 10 feet, I essentially do, navigating by the feel of the trail under my boots, and the sound of the creek, and the particular way the terrain shifts at each junction and turn. I know the creek crossing at mile 1.3, where the stepping stones are slick with moss on the downstream side and dry on the upstream side, and where I always cross using the third stone from the left because it's the flattest. I know the rock outcrop at mile 2.7, a shelf of sandstone that provides the only open view on the entire loop, the drainage spreading below in a carpet of green that turns to fire in October. I know the split oak at mile 4, a massive red oak that lightning or wind split vertically in 2018, the two halves leaning apart over the trail in an arch that looks deliberately constructed, as if someone had designed a gateway and used a tree to build it. The morning was a Saturday in late September. Clear sky, mid-50s, the first suggestion of fall in the understory where the maples were beginning to turn while the canopy held its green. I signed the trail register at 8:15, the way I always do, noting my name, the date, and my intended route. The lot had 4 other cars in it. A normal Saturday morning. The first 3 miles were unremarkable. Creek trail to the ridge, the steady climb that I've calibrated in my legs to the point where I know my position by the burn in my calves. The creek crossing was where it always was. The stepping stones were the same. The outcrop was the same shelf of sandstone, with the same view in the same flat spot where I always sit and drink water. The split oak was the same split oak, the two halves arching over the trail with the same gap between them, the bark darkened with age, the leaves on both sides beginning their annual transition. After the split oak, the trail should have curved west and descended through the switchbacks to the creek bottom. This is the point where the loop turns back on itself, the trajectory reversing from south to north, the elevation dropping steadily for about a mile until the trail meets the creek and the creek leads you home. I've walked this descent 30 times. I know the first switchback, where a root crosses the trail at ankle height and catches your boot if you're not paying attention. I know the second, where the grade eases and the forest shifts from oak hickory to hemlock, and the light changes from bright to filtered. The switchbacks weren't there. The trail continued south along the ridge, straight and level, through forest that was identical to the forest I'd been walking through for the last mile. Same trees, same blazes, the white rectangles painted on trunks at the correct intervals. Same trail surface, packed dirt with a scatter of gravel and leaves. The trail was the trail. It just wouldn't turn. I checked my watch. 3 hours. The descent should have started 20 minutes ago. I checked the GPS on my phone. The blue dot showed me on the ridge, approaching the point where the trail should curve west. According to the device, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, but the terrain in front of me was showing no sign of the curve or the descent. The trail went straight into forest that repeated itself, with an exactness that was beginning to feel less like familiarity and more like something else. I kept walking. The trail descended to a creek. I crossed on stepping stones, the same moss on the downstream side, the same dry surface on the third stone from the left. I was at the creek crossing, mile 1.3. The beginning of the loop. I'd walked 9 miles and arrived at the point where the first 3 miles start, as if the end of the trail had been sutured to the beginning without the seam that the trailhead represents. I climbed. The ridge again. The outcrop again. The sandstone shelf with the same view, the drainage below showing the same carpet of green with the same early color in the understory. The split oak again. The arch, the bark, the gap, the leaves beginning to turn. The trail continues south instead of curving west, the creek crossing again. The same stones. I was cycling. The trail was running the same 9-mile sequence on repeat, delivering me back to the creek crossing at the end of each cycle without ever passing through the trailhead, the way a loop of tape plays the same recording over and over, the end spliced to the beginning so seamlessly that the repetition has no interruption. Every landmark was correct. Every blaze was in the right position. The trail was accurate in every physical detail, except the one that mattered, which was that it wouldn't end. I walked the cycle 3 times. Each pass took about 2 hours, which was slightly faster than my normal pace. The anxiety of the situation converting to speed in the way that unease always accelerates movement. The creek, the ridge, the outcrop, the oak. The ridge continues south. The creek, the ridge, the outcrop, the oak, each cycle identical, each landmark in the same place, each blaze on the same tree. The forest was a photograph of itself, reprinted with perfect fidelity, the same image appearing again and again in a gallery with no exit. I stopped at the outcrop on the 4th pass. I was tired. 8 hours of walking on water and a granola bar, the deep, hollow fatigue that comes from sustained effort without adequate fuel. My legs were heavy. My feet hurt in the specific way that feet hurt when they've been in boots too long on terrain that's too hard. I sat on the sandstone ledge, and I looked at the drainage below, and I decided to stop walking. The decision wasn't strategic. I didn't reason that stopping might break the cycle. I stopped because I was tired, and because continuing to walk a trail that wouldn't end felt less like persistence and more like compliance, as if walking was what the trail wanted me to do. And doing what the trail wanted was the mechanism that kept the cycle running. I sat, and I drank the last of my water, and I waited. 20 minutes. The forest was quiet around me, normal quiet. The September sounds of wind and birds and the creek below are carrying on their business without reference to my situation. Nothing changed. Nothing signaled a shift. I sat on the rock, and the rock was the same, and the forest was the same. And the time passed the way time passes when you're sitting still and waiting for something you can't name. The wind came from the drainage, not a gust. A sustained, directional flow of air that rose from the creek bottom and climbed the slope with a deliberateness that felt less like weather and more like exhalation. It pressed against my face and filled my sinuses with a scent that didn't belong to the forest. Sweet, dense, old. The concentrated, cloying sweetness of flowers that have been standing in water past the point of freshness. The smell of lilies or roses that have crossed the line from fragrant to fermented. The particular olfactory signature of organic beauty in the process of becoming organic decay. The smell of a funeral arrangement on the 4th day. The smell of something alive and beautiful is now neither. The wind lasted about 30 seconds. It filled the hollow and pressed against the outcrop and saturated the air with its sweet rot scent. And then it passed, climbing the ridge behind me and dissipating into the canopy. When it was gone, the air felt different. Not cleaner, released. The way a room feels when someone who was holding their breath finally exhales, and the tension that their held breath was producing in the atmosphere dissolves, and the space returns to its natural state. I stood up. I walked. The trail descended from the outcrop the way it was supposed to, the switchbacks appearing in the correct order, the route at ankle height on the first turn, the hemlock transition on the second, the grade easing and the elevation dropping, and the creek sound growing louder as I descended toward the bottom of the drainage. The trail reached the creek. It turned north. It followed the water toward the trailhead. The distance closed. The trail ended. The parking lot was empty. My car, a green Subaru, was the only vehicle in the lot. Every other hiker who had signed the register that morning had come and gone while I was walking a loop that wouldn't close. The dashboard clock read 7:20. I'd left at 8:15 in the morning, 11 hours. 11 hours on a trail that takes 3, walking the same 9 miles at least 4 times, passing the same creek and the same outcrop and the same split oak with the same precision on every pass. The trail reproducing itself with a fidelity that left no room for doubt that I was on the right trail, and no explanation for why the right trail wouldn't bring me home. I checked my phone. The GPS track showed a straight line from the trailhead to the outcrop and back. 3 miles out, 3 miles back, 6 miles total. The track showed no ridge walk, no split oak, no repeated cycles, no 30-mile odyssey through the same 9-mile corridor. The device said I'd taken a walk to the outcrop and come back. My body said I'd walked for 11 hours and covered enough ground to have hiked from Elkins to the state line. One of them was wrong. The GPS was a machine that recorded what its sensors measured. My body was a machine that recorded what its muscles experienced, and the two machines disagreed with each other in a way that neither could resolve. I've hiked the loop since, 4 times. Each time it worked. 9 miles, 3 hours. The switchbacks descending where they're supposed to descend. The trailhead appearing where it's supposed to appear. The trail works. The loop closes. The walk ends, the way it's supposed to. The way it always did until the day it didn't. But I pause at the outcrop now. Every time. I sit on the sandstone ledge, and I look at the drainage, and I wait for the wind. Not because I want to smell the sweet rot scent again. Because I want to know if the wind is what opened the trail, or if the wind is what the trail produces when it's finished with you, the exhaled breath of a forest that has been holding something and has decided to let it go. And I wonder what would have happened if the wind hadn't come. If I'd sat on that rock until dark, and the dark had filled the hollow, and the trail had stayed closed, and the loop had kept cycling through the night, the same 9 miles, the same landmarks, the same blazes on the same trees, running the same recording in the same gallery with no exit while I sat on a rock and waited for permission from a forest that might never have granted it. I wonder how long the forest would have kept me, and I wonder if it's kept others. Hikers who walked the same loop and hit the same cycle, and who didn't stop, who kept walking because stopping felt like giving up, and the trail kept going because walking was what it wanted. Hikers who are still walking, still passing the creek crossing and the outcrop and the split oak and the ridge that never curves west, still cycling, still on the trail, still looking for a trailhead that the forest has hidden behind a loop that never ends, walking and walking and walking through the same 9 miles of correct, familiar, perfectly blazed trail that goes on forever, because forever is what the forest has, and forever is what it takes. The Cranberry Wilderness is about 16,000 acres of unmanaged forest in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, one of the largest wilderness areas in the state, and one of the most remote sections of publicly accessible land east of the Mississippi. The terrain is a maze of drainages and ridgelines that climb to over 4,000 feet. The forest, a mix of northern hardwood and spruce, that gives the landscape a quality more common to Maine or Vermont than to the mid-Atlantic. The trails are maintained at the minimum level that wilderness designation requires, which means blazes and basic tread work and nothing else. No bridges, no signs at junctions, no amenities of any kind. You navigate by map and compass, and the institutional memory of having walked the trails enough times to know where you are by the shape of the ground beneath your feet. I've been hiking the Cranberry since 2018, when I moved to the area and started exploring the backcountry of Pocahontas County with the systematic thoroughness of a person who needs the woods the way other people need the gym. I go alone, not because I prefer solitude, though I do, but because the kind of hiking I do in the Cranberry, long days on unmaintained trails and terrain, where the nearest road is 6 miles away and cell signal is a concept rather than a reality, requires a pace and a tolerance for discomfort that most of the people I know don't share. I walk fast. I navigate by feel. I carry minimal gear because minimal gear means minimal weight, and minimal weight means maximum distance. I've covered most of the trail system in the Cranberry over the last 6 years, some sections once, some sections dozens of times, and I consider the wilderness as close to a home landscape as any place I've lived. The hike was a day trip on a Saturday in mid-October of 2023. I'd parked at the Cranberry Glades trailhead on the south side of the wilderness and planned to hike north along the Cranberry River Trail for about 7 miles before looping back on a ridge trail that would bring me to the trailhead. By mid-afternoon, it was a familiar route, one I'd done at least 10 times, and I started walking at 8 in the morning with the confidence of a person who knows where he's going and how long it will take to get there. The confidence was premature. I miscalculated the distance on the ridge trail, which I'd last hiked in summer when the foliage was full, and the landmarks were partially obscured by leaves. In October, with the canopy thinning and the understory open, the trail looked different, the way any trail looks different when the season changes and the visual references shift. I spent about 45 minutes at a junction I didn't recognize, trying to reconcile my position with the map before realizing I'd overshot a turn and needed to backtrack about a mile. The backtracking ate time. By the time I'd corrected my course and was heading south toward the trailhead, the sun was lower than it should have been, and in the light in the forest was the amber going to gray that means you have about an hour of usable daylight left. I walked faster. The trail was familiar from this direction, the descent through the hardwood toward the cranberry glades recognizable even in the changing light. I checked my watch. 5:15. Sunset would be around 6:30, which gave me an hour and 15 minutes to cover about 2 miles, easily manageable at my pace. But the light was going faster than the clock suggested, the way mountain light goes in October, when the ridges block the low sun and the shadows climb the slope, and the forest floor goes dark while the canopy still holds the last gold of the afternoon. By 5:45, the canopy was gray and the floor was dark, and by 6, the headlamp was necessary. I wasn't worried. I had the lamp. I had the trail. I had 2 miles of well-maintained path between me and the parking lot, and I'd hiked in the dark before, more times than I'd like to admit, the product of a chronic optimism about how much daylight remains that has been contradicted by reality often enough that I carry a headlamp the way I carry water, as a non-negotiable piece of equipment that I hope not to need and frequently do. The forest at night in the cranberry wilderness is a different environment from the forest during the day. This is not a metaphor. The acoustic properties change. The visual references disappear. The spatial awareness that you maintain unconsciously during daylight, the constant background processing of distance and direction, and the relationship of your body to the terrain, narrows to the cone of your headlamp beam and the few feet of trail surface that the beam illuminates. The world contracts. You walk in a bubble of light through a darkness that presses against the edges of the bubble with a weight that is not physical but that you feel anyway. The weight of a forest that is very large and very dark, and very aware that you are very small and very lit and very alone. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes in the dark when I heard the footsteps. Not behind me, which is where the imagination places threatening sounds, because behind is where you can't see, and can't see is where fear lives. Beside me, in the forest, about 15 feet off the right side of the trail, the understory of mountain laurel and rhododendron grew in the dense, dark tangle that characterizes the forest floor at this elevation. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. The rhythmic, repetitive sound of feet on leaf litter. The crunch and rustle that a body produces when it walks through the dry, deep leaves of an October forest floor. The sound was moving. It was keeping pace with me. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. Not a beat later. Not the delayed cessation that an echo produces, where the reflected sound continues for a fraction of a second after the source stops. The footsteps stopped at the same instant I stopped, simultaneously, as if whatever was producing them was connected to my legs by a mechanism that transmitted my motor commands without delay. My left foot touched the ground and stopped, and the last footstep in the forest stopped at the same moment, the sound cutting off with a synchronization so precise that it felt less like 2 separate sources stopping and more like one source stopping, as if the footsteps and my feet were the same instrument playing the same note and silencing at the same time. I stood still. The forest was quiet. The specific, layered quiet of a mountain forest at night, where the absence of human sound is filled by the presence of everything else. The wind, the creek somewhere below, the distant call of a barred owl claiming its territory. Normal sounds, the sounds that should exist and do exist, and that provide the acoustic baseline against which anomalous sounds are measured. The footsteps were not part of the baseline. They had no source in the normal lexicon of forest sounds. They were boots on leaves. The specific, recognizable sound of footwear, not hooves, not paws, not the soft pad of bare feet. Boots. The hard-soled, heavy-treaded sound of a person walking through a forest in the kind of footwear that people wear when they walk through forests. I shone my headlamp into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated the forest at the point where I estimated the footsteps had been. Tree trunks, leaf litter. Mountain laurel has glossy, dark leaves reflecting the beam with the waxy sheen that laurel produces. The underbrush was dense, but not impenetrable. The kind of forest floor that a person could walk through, if they were willing to push through branches and step over logs and accept the scratches and the effort that off-trail travel requires. But nobody was there. The beam showed me exactly what it should have shown me in a forest at night, which was a forest. Trees and leaves and darkness, and nothing that explained the sound of synchronized footsteps 15 feet from where I was standing. I started walking. The footsteps started, same pace, same timing, same distance, approximately 15 feet off the right side of the trail, maintaining the lateral spacing with a consistency that suggested that whatever it was had established a comfortable distance and intended to maintain it. I walked at my normal pace. The footsteps matched. I walked faster, extending my stride and increasing my cadence to a speed that was just below a jog. The footsteps matched. The crunch of leaves on both sides of the equation, mine on the packed dirt of the trail and theirs on the leaf litter of the forest floor, accelerate in tandem, the two sound sources maintaining their synchronization with a fidelity that goes beyond coincidence and into territory that the word mirroring barely covers. I stopped again, mid-stride, mid-step, the kind of abrupt, unannounced stop that a person makes when they're testing a hypothesis. My right foot was in the air when I stopped, the step incomplete, my body caught between one position and the next. The footsteps stopped at the same instant, not when my foot touched the ground, which is when the sound of a footstep is produced. When I stopped the motion of stepping, which is before the sound occurs. Whatever was beside me was not responding to the sound of my footsteps. It was responding to the movement. It was watching my body, not listening to my feet. It was mirroring my motion, not my noise. And it was doing so with a temporal precision that eliminated reaction time, the delay between stimulus and response that every living thing requires, the processing interval that means any mirrored action should lag behind the original by at least a fraction of a second. There was no lag. The footsteps in my feet were simultaneous, perfectly, exactly, impossibly simultaneous. I walked the remaining 2 miles to the trailhead. I didn't stop again. I didn't shine the lamp into the forest again. I walked at a steady pace, and I listened to the footsteps beside me, and the footsteps walked at a steady pace, and the two of us, me and whatever was pacing me through the October darkness of the cranberry wilderness, covered the distance in about 40 minutes, walking in a parallel tandem that should have been terrifying and was, instead, something I can only describe as intimate. The footsteps were close, 15 feet, close enough that on a quiet night in a forest with good acoustics, I could hear individual leaves crackling under the weight that was producing the sound. Close enough that the presence, the physical nearness of something that was choosing to walk beside me and that was matching my pace with a precision that exceeded anything I could achieve deliberately, felt less like surveillance and more like accompaniment. Something was walking with me, not following, not stalking. Walking with me, the way a companion walks with you, maintaining the distance that companionship requires, not so close that it intrudes, and not so far that it disconnects. The spatial relationship of two bodies that are sharing a journey without sharing a conversation. I reached the parking lot. The gravel of the lot crunched under my boots with a sound that was different from the sound of the trail, the specific acoustic signature of the boundary between the forest and the managed space that human beings have cleared and surfaced and designated as the place where the wilderness ends and the rest of the world begins. I stepped onto the gravel. The footsteps beside me did not step onto the gravel. They continued, past the parking lot, past the trailhead, into the forest that extended beyond the boundary of the wilderness area. The trees and the darkness continued south while I stood in the lot and listened. The footsteps maintained the same pace, the same rhythm, the same steady, synchronized cadence that they'd maintained for 2 miles, walking into the darkness beyond the trailhead without slowing, without stopping, without the hesitation that the end of a shared journey should produce. They walked away from me with the same precision they'd walked beside me, each step identical to the last, each crunch of leaves matching a footstep that I was no longer taking, the synchronization breaking for the first time as the footsteps continued and I stood still and the distance between us grew. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. The sound faded with distance, the way any sound fades, gradually, the individual footsteps losing definition until the sound became a texture, and then a suggestion, and then nothing. The forest was quiet. The parking lot was dark. My car was the only vehicle in the lot. I haven't hiked the Cranberry at night since. Not because I'm afraid, because I don't want to know if the footsteps would come back. And because part of me, the part that I don't talk about and that I don't examine too closely, suspects that the footsteps never stopped. Whatever was walking beside me in the dark is still walking, still in the forest, still keeping pace with something that I can't see and that I wasn't meant to see, still moving through the leaves at a steady pace, synchronized to a set of feet that it chose to mirror on a night in October and that it continues to mirror in the darkness of a forest where nobody is walking. My steps, repeated, my pace, maintained, my companion, still walking beside me through a forest that I left 2 years ago, and that it, apparently, never did. My partner Rachel and I started section hiking the Allegheny Trail in 2022. The Allegheny is one of those long-distance trails that exists more as an aspiration than a finished product, a 300-mile route that runs the length of West Virginia from the Pennsylvania border to the Virginia border, pieced together from maintained trails and forest roads and sections of new construction that the West Virginia Scenic Trails Association has been building and maintaining since the 1970s. The trail passes through some of the most remote and least visited sections of the Monongahela and the George Washington National Forests, terrain that ranges from high-elevation spruce bogs to deep river gorges to the rolling hardwood ridges that constitute the backbone of the Allegheny Mountains. We were hiking it in sections, driving to access points on weekends, and walking 10 or 15 miles at a stretch, camping overnight when the distance required it, day hiking when the section was short enough. Our system was leisurely and unsystematic, choosing sections based on weather and mood rather than geographic order, skipping the easy sections in favor of the remote ones that required more planning and more commitment. By the fall of 2023, we'd covered about 120 miles of the trail, distributed across the state in a patchwork that a GPS track would show as a series of disconnected line segments rather than a continuous path. The section in Greenbrier County was one we'd been saving. It runs along a ridge south of Durban, about 12 miles of trail, through old-growth hardwood that the Forest Service considers some of the finest remaining timber in the state. The ridge is high, 3,500 to 4,000 feet, and the trail follows the crest through a forest of massive red oak and sugar, maple and yellow birch. The trunks 3 and 4 feet in diameter, the canopy high and closed, the understory open, with the particular cathedral quality that old-growth forests produce when the upper canopy has been stable long enough to shade out everything beneath it. We drove to the access point on a Friday afternoon in early October and hiked about 6 miles south along the ridge before making camp at a site that the Trail Association maintains, a flat area with a fire ring and a log for sitting, and a spring about 100 yards downhill. The hike-in was uneventful and beautiful, the fall color at peak, the oaks and maples producing the reds and oranges that make the Alleghenies in October one of the most spectacular landscapes in the eastern United States. The trail was well blazed with the standard white rectangular blazes that the Allegheny Trail uses, painted on trees at intervals of about 100 yards, clear and visible and consistent with every other section of the trail we'd hiked. We camped, we ate, we built a fire, watched the stars through the canopy, talked, and went to bed in the tent around 9. Normal backcountry camping. The kind of evening that Rachel and I have shared dozens of times in the mountains of West Virginia, and that constitutes, for both of us, the best version of a Friday night that either of us has found. Saturday morning, we packed camp and began hiking back north, retracing the 6 miles we'd covered the previous afternoon. The plan was to reach the access point by early afternoon and drive to Marlinton for dinner and a night in a motel, the particular luxury that backcountry hikers permit themselves after a night on the ground. About 2 miles into the return hike, Rachel stopped. She was walking ahead of me, the way she usually does, because her pace is slightly faster, and she prefers to set the speed rather than follow mine. She stopped and looked at a tree on the right side of the trail, a large red oak with a blaze on it at about chest height. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "That's not the same blaze." I walked up beside her and looked. The blaze on the tree was white. It was painted at the standard height, about 5 feet from the ground. It was the same width as a standard rectangular trail blaze, about 2 inches. But it wasn't a rectangle. It was a symbol. A vertical line, about 6 inches tall, crossed near the top by a shorter horizontal line, about 3 inches wide. The result looked like a crude cross, or like a simplified human figure with outstretched arms, a stick figure reduced to its most basic components, a body and 2 arms, painted in white on the bark of a red oak, on a trail that had been blazed with standard white rectangles the previous afternoon. I looked at the next tree with a blaze, same symbol, and the next, same symbol. Every blaze on every tree that I could see from my position on the trail had been changed. The standard white rectangles that had guided us south the previous afternoon were gone, replaced by the cross figure symbol, painted in the same white paint at the same height on the same trees, not painted over the rectangles. Instead of the rectangles, the bark beneath the symbols showed no evidence of a previous blaze, no paint residue, no rectangular outline beneath the new mark. The symbols were the only blazes on the trees, as if they had always been the only blazes, as if the rectangles that Rachel and I had followed for 6 miles the previous day had never existed. Rachel photographed them. She's a more systematic documenter than I am, the kind of person who photographs trail conditions and blaze quality as a matter of routine, maintaining a visual record of every section she hikes that she sends to the Trail Association as volunteer trail monitoring data. She photographed the symbols on 6 consecutive trees, capturing the mark, the height, the tree species, and the surrounding trail context. She compared the photographs to the images she'd taken the previous afternoon of the same section of trail. The afternoon photographs showed standard white rectangular blazes on the same trees. The morning photographs showed the cross figure symbols. Same trees, same paint height, same trail, different marks. We hiked the remaining 4 miles to the access point. Every blaze on the return hike was the symbol. Not a single rectangle remained. The entire section of trail, 6 miles of maintained Allegheny Trail through old-growth forest on a ridge in Greenbrier County, had been reblazed overnight with a symbol that neither of us recognized from any trail marking system in use, in West Virginia or anywhere else. We drove to Marlinton. The Forest Service office is in a small building on the main street, a ranger station that serves the Marlinton district of the Monongahela and that maintains jurisdiction over the section of the Allegheny Trail we'd been hiking. The ranger on duty was a woman named Stokes, who had been with the Forest Service for about 15 years and who managed the trail coordination for the district. Rachel showed her the photographs. The morning photographs, the ones showing the cross-figure symbols on the trees. Stokes looked at the photographs on Rachel's phone. She scrolled through them slowly, expanding each image, examining the symbols with the focused attention of someone who recognizes what she's seeing and is trying to reconcile the recognition with the impossibility of it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up from the phone and said, "Those are the original blazes," she explained. When the Allegheny Trail was first cut through that section in the mid-1970s, the Trail Association used a different marking system than the standard white rectangle that they adopted later. The original blazes were exactly what we'd photographed. A vertical line crossed by a shorter horizontal line near the top, a symbol that the original trail builders had chosen for reasons that Stokes didn't know and that the association's records didn't explain. The symbol was used from the trail's establishment in approximately 1975 until the mid-1980s, when the association standardized its marking system and repainted every section of the trail with the white rectangles that are now used throughout the system. Stokes said the original blazes had been painted over in the 1980s. Not removed, painted over. The rectangles were applied directly on top of the original symbols, covering them with a larger, standardized mark. Over the subsequent decades, the trees had grown, the bark expanding and stretching, and eventually absorbing the paint layers as the cambium added new wood beneath the bark surface. Blazes that are painted on trees have a lifespan of about 5 to 10 years before the tree's growth either stretches the paint beyond recognition or buries it beneath new bark. The original symbols from the 1970s would have been invisible within a decade, covered first by the rectangle paint and then by bark growth. By 2023, the original blazes had been buried under almost 50 years of tree growth and at least 4 subsequent repaintings. There was no mechanism by which they could be visible. She looked at the photographs again. She zoomed in on the paint. She said the paint looked fresh, not new fresh, not the bright, wet white of recently applied paint. Fresh in the way that a blaze looks fresh when it's been applied within the last few years. The paint still adheres to the bark surface, the edges are still clean, and the color is still white rather than the gray-yellow that weathering produces over time. She said the symbols were on the same trees at the same height as the originals, which was consistent with the 1970s markings, but the paint was too fresh, and the trees had added nearly 50 years of growth since the symbols were first applied, which meant the paint height should have shifted upward as the tree grew, the way all blazes shift upward over time, as the trunk adds wood beneath the marked point. The symbols in the photographs were at the original height, 5 feet, as if they'd been painted on trees that hadn't grown in 50 years, or as if they'd been painted yesterday on trees that had been growing the entire time. She said that's not possible. She said the trees have grown. She said the bark has been repainted multiple times. She said the original symbols have been buried under decades of paint and bark growth. She said what you photographed cannot be the original blazes, because the original blazes no longer exist on those trees. She looked at the photographs one more time. She said, but those are the original blazes. She didn't say what was possible. She filed a report. She said she'd send a crew to investigate. Rachel and I drove to the motel in Marlinton and ate dinner at a restaurant on the main street, and didn't talk about the blazes until we were lying in bed in the dark, and the silence of the motel room felt too thin to hold the weight of what we'd seen. Rachel said something that I've thought about every day since. She said the trail was remembered. She said it the way she says things that she believes but can't prove, with a quiet certainty that doesn't invite debate. She said the trail remembered what it looked like when it was first cut, when the first blazes were painted by the first people who walked that ridge and marked the trees with a symbol that meant something to them, something important enough that they chose it over a simple rectangle, something that the association later replaced with standardization, and that the trees later buried with growth. She said the trail remembered, and on one night in October, it went back. Not the whole trail, just the blazes, just the marks that the first hands had put on the first trees to say, this is the way, follow this. This is where the path goes. The trail went back to its original language, the language it was speaking before anyone told it to speak something else. I went back to that section 2 weeks later, alone. I hiked the 6 miles south along the Ridge A, and I looked at every tree that had a blaze on it. Standard white rectangles. Everyone. The symbols were gone. The trail had been reblazed, or the symbols had reverted, or whatever had happened on that October night had unhappened. The trail returning to its current language after a single night of speaking the old one. Stokes called me a week after that. She said the crew had inspected the section and found standard rectangular blazes in good condition on all marked trees. She said they'd found no evidence of the symbols. She said she'd filed a report noting the discrepancy between the photographs and the field inspection, and that the report would remain in the district files. She said she didn't have an explanation. She said it in a way that told me she wasn't going to look for one. The photographs are on Rachel's phone. The symbols are clear. The paint is white. The trees are the same trees that now carry rectangles that look like they've been there for years. And somewhere in the file cabinet of the Marlinton Ranger Station, there's a report that documents a night when a 50-year-old trail in the Monongahela National Forest replaced its modern blazes with the original marks that its builders had painted in the 1970s, symbols that meant something that nobody alive remembers, and that the trail, apparently, has never forgotten. I run trails the way some people drive highways, as transportation between the version of myself that exists at the start and the better version that exists at the finish. I started trail running in graduate school at Virginia Tech, where the proximity of the Jefferson National Forest to campus meant that a person with running shoes and an hour of free time could be on a single-track trail within 15 minutes of leaving the library. The forest became my release valve, the place where the pressure of a doctoral program and the particular grinding anxiety of academic life could be converted into something physical, something measurable, something that ended with sweat and fatigue, and the quiet clarity that sustained effort produces in a mind that has been thinking too much and moving too little. I've been running the trails around Blacksburg for 9 years. I know them the way a commuter knows a highway system. Every junction, every surface change, every section where the grade tilts enough to change my stride. The Jefferson National Forest surrounds Blacksburg on 3 sides, and the trail system within running distance of town is extensive enough that I can put together loops of 10, 15, or 20 miles without repeating a section. I run 3 or 4 times a week, year-round, in conditions that range from the humid, insect-thick mornings of July to the frozen, ice-glazed trails of January. The forest is my gym and my therapist, and the place where I do my best thinking, which is to say, the place where I stop thinking and let the body do what the body was designed to do, which is move. The trail where it happened is a section of the Appalachian Trail that runs along a ridge about 8 miles south of Blacksburg, accessible by a connector trail that climbs from a parking area on a forest road to the ridgeline where the AT passes through. The section is about 3 miles of ridge running, moderate terrain, the trail winding through mixed hardwood with occasional views to the west over the New River Valley. I've run this section probably 200 times. It's my default route, the run I do when I don't have a plan and just need to move. The trail surface is packed dirt and rock, the standard AT tread that volunteers maintain with hand tools, and the particular obsessive dedication that Appalachian Trail clubs bring to the work of keeping the footway functional. The run was on a Wednesday afternoon in late October of 2023. I'd left campus around 3, driven to the forest road, parked at the usual spot, and started up the connector trail at my usual pace. The weather was cool and overcast, the temperature in the low 50s, the kind of fall afternoon that produces ideal running conditions, warm enough that you don't need layers, cool enough that the air feels clean, and the effort doesn't produce the heavy, oxygen-debt breathing that summer heat creates. The forest was in transition, the canopy thinning, the leaves falling in a steady, gentle rain that covered the trail surface with a fresh layer of yellow and orange and brown. I reached the ridgeline and turned south on the AT, settling into the rhythm that ridge running produces, a steady, moderate pace that accommodates the gentle undulations of the terrain without requiring the intense effort that climbing demands. I was about 2 miles into the ridge section, in a stretch of trail that passes through a stand of mature oak, when I heard it. A child is crying. The sound was faint at first, the way sounds are faint when they're coming from a distance or from behind a barrier, the volume reduced but the quality preserved, every characteristic of the sound intact except its loudness. It was a child, young. The high, thin, wavering cry of a child who is maybe 3 or 4 years old, the pitch and the cadence specific to that age, the particular sound that a very young child produces when they're frightened or in pain or lost, the cry that is designed by evolution to trigger a response in any adult who hears it, the sound that you cannot hear without your body reacting, your pace slowing, your head turning, your attention redirecting from whatever you were doing to the location of the sound. I stopped running. I stood on the trail, and I listened. The crying continued, steady, rhythmic, the inconsolable repetition of a child who has been crying long enough that the crying has become its own rhythm, each cry following the last with the mechanical regularity of a distress signal, not the variable, escalating cry of a child who is responding to a changing situation, but the sustained, unchanging cry of a child who has been in the same situation for a long time and has settled into the pattern that sustained distress produces. The sound was not coming from the forest on either side of the trail. I turned my head, left and right. the way you turn your head when you're trying to localize a sound, using the difference in arrival time between your two ears to determine the direction of the source. The sound didn't shift. It didn't resolve to the left or the right. It stayed centered, directly beneath me, coming from below the trail surface. I knelt. I pressed my ear to the packed dirt of the trail. The crying was louder, clearer, closer. The barrier between my ear and the source had been reduced from about 5 feet of air to 0. My ear pressed against the ground, and the crying came through the dirt with a clarity that was startling. A child, directly below me, beneath the trail surface, crying with the steady, rhythmic distress of a young child who has been frightened and who doesn't understand what's happening, and who is producing the only sound they know how to produce, which is a cry for help. The sound had the quality of proximity, not the distant, diffuse sound of something reverberating through a cave system or a hollow space. The close, intimate, near-field quality of a sound produced within arm's reach, as if the child was just beneath the surface of the trail, separated from my ear by a few inches of compacted dirt and rock, rather than the several feet that the trail's construction would suggest. The crying was right there, beneath my cheek, beneath the packed earth that my knees were pressing into. A child, close enough to touch if the ground between us wasn't there. I called out. I said hello. I said it's okay. I said, can you hear me? The words that any person would say to a crying child, the instinctive, protective language that adults produce when they encounter a child in distress. The crying didn't change. It continued with the same rhythm, the same pitch, the same volume, as if my voice hadn't reached the child, or as if the child was beyond the reach of comfort, locked in a state of distress that external input couldn't modify. I pressed my palms flat against the trail surface. The dirt was cold, October cold, the temperature of the ground that has been losing heat to the shortening days for weeks. There was no vibration, no movement beneath the surface that would suggest a cavity or a space or anything hollow enough to contain a source of sound. The ground felt solid, packed and dense, the compacted earth and rock that trail surfaces develop over decades of foot traffic, the kind of surface that you could drive a truck over without leaving more than a shallow impression. I stood up. I marked the GPS coordinates on my phone. I memorized the location, a point on the trail between two large oaks, about 50 feet south of a rock outcrop that I used as a landmark on my runs. I turned around and I ran, not away from the sound, toward help. I ran the 2 miles back to the connector trail and down to the parking area in about 15 minutes, a pace that was faster than my usual speed, and that was powered by the particular urgency that the sound of a crying child produces in the body of any adult who is not a monster. I called the ranger station from the parking lot. My phone had signal there, 2 bars, enough to make a call that connected on the second attempt. I told the ranger on duty what I'd heard. A child crying from beneath the trail surface, on the AT, approximately 2 miles south of the connector junction. I gave the GPS coordinates. The ranger, a man whose name I didn't catch, said he'd send a team. He said it with a tone I didn't recognize at the time, but that I've since identified as familiarity, the tone of a person who is hearing information they've heard before and who is responding with a procedure they've followed before. The team went out the next morning. 2 rangers and a geologist from the Forest Service's regional office. They hiked to the coordinates I'd provided, D, and they spent about 3 hours at the site. They inspected the trail surface. They used ground-penetrating radar to examine the subsurface structure beneath the trail. They checked for sinkholes, cave systems, abandoned mine shafts, natural voids, any space beneath the surface that could contain a person or amplify a sound, D, or provide an acoustic pathway for a sound produced at a distance to be channeled to a specific point on the surface. They found nothing. The geological survey showed metamorphic bedrock beneath the trail surface at that point, the dense, folded rock that underlies the entire Jefferson National Forest in that section of the Blue Ridge. No voids, no caves, no shafts, no spaces of any kind. The rock was solid from the trail surface to a depth of at least 30 feet, which was as far as the ground-penetrating radar could resolve. Whatever was beneath the trail was rock, dense, continuous, unbroken rock. No cavity large enough to hold a child. No cavity large enough to hold a mouse. Nothing but the geological substrate that has been beneath that ridge for 300 million years. The lead ranger called me that evening. He gave me the results. No subsurface anomalies. No explanation for what I'd heard. He said this in the measured, factual tone that government employees use when delivering findings that are technically complete but practically useless. Then he said something that he probably shouldn't have said, but that I'm grateful he did. He said I wasn't the first person to report crying on that section of the trail. He said hikers had been reporting the sound for at least 15 years. Always the same section, between the two oaks, near the rock outcrop. Always the same description, a young child crying from beneath the trail. Always with the same characteristics, the steady, rhythmic, inconsolable cry that continued without change regardless of what the listener said or did. He said teams had investigated multiple times. Ground-penetrating radar, acoustic analysis, geological survey. Each investigation found the same thing, which was nothing. Solid rock, no voids, no explanation. He said they never find anything. He said it with the resignation of a man who has filed enough reports on this subject to know that the reports produce nothing except more reports. He said the Forest Service's official position is that the sound is an acoustic anomaly, a natural phenomenon in which ambient sounds, wind, water, and animal vocalizations are channeled and amplified by the terrain in a way that produces the impression of a human voice at a specific point on the trail surface. He said this is the explanation that the reports contain and that the regional office accepts. He said he personally didn't find it convincing. He said wind doesn't cry like a 3-year-old. He said he'd pressed his own ear to the ground on that section of trail and he'd heard it too. And he said it's not wind. I still run that section. I run it because the trail is my trail and the ridge is my ridge, and I refuse to let a sound change the geography of my life. But I slow down when I pass the two oaks. I listen. Sometimes I hear nothing, just the normal ambient sound of a forest in whatever season I'm running through. Sometimes I hear it, faint, far below. The steady rhythmic crying of a child who has been underground for longer than anyone has been listening and who will be underground after everyone who has listened has stopped. I don't kneel anymore. I don't press my ear to the dirt. I listen from standing height, and I let the distance between my ears and the ground soften the sound enough that I can continue running without the crying following me home. But it follows me anyway. Not the sound, the knowledge. The knowledge that beneath a section of trail that I've run 200 times, beneath solid metamorphic rock that has been there for 300 million years, something is crying, something young, something frightened, something that has been calling for help from a place where help can't reach it, through rock that shouldn't carry sound and dirt that shouldn't transmit it, crying with the patient, endless persistence of something that doesn't know it can't be saved, or something that knows and cries anyway. Because crying is what you do when you're alone in the dark, and nobody is coming, and the only thing left is the sound of your own voice telling the world above that you're still there, still below, still waiting, still crying. I hike the Pisgah National Forest year-round, including the months that most recreational hikers consider off-season, the gray, cold, stripped-down months of December and January and February, when the canopy is bare and the understory is brown and the trails are empty. Why in the forest reveals the architecture that summer hides. I prefer winter hiking to summer hiking, in the way that some people prefer black and white photographs to color, the reduction of information creating a clarity that abundance obscures. In winter, the forest is bones. The structure of the ridges, the drainages, and the creek systems is visible in a way that the full canopy of summer doesn't permit. You can see further. You can hear further. The acoustic properties of a leafless forest are different from those of a leafed one, the sounds traveling further and arriving cleaner, without the dampening effect that millions of leaves produce when they absorb and scatter the vibrations that move through the air. I was hiking a section of trail in the Shining Rock district of the Pisgah, about 15 miles south of Asheville, on a Monday morning in the second week of December 2023. The trail was an old logging road that had been converted to a hiking trail in the 1970s, a wide, gentle path that followed a creek upstream through a drainage that climbed from about 3,000 feet to just under 5,000. The trail was well maintained, the surface packed dirt and gravel, the kind of forest road that becomes a comfortable hiking trail when the vegetation softens the edges, and the canopy closes over the roadbed, and the passage of feet replaces the passage of trucks. The temperature at the trailhead was 22 degrees. I noted it on the thermometer that hangs from the trail register post, a small mercury tube in a plastic housing that the Forest Service installed to give hikers a reference point for conditions on the trail. 22 degrees. Cold enough that the puddles on the forest road were frozen solid, the ice thick enough to hold my weight without cracking. Cold enough that the leaf litter on the trail was stiff with frost, each leaf coated with a thin white layer of ice crystals that crunched under my boots with the particular sound that frozen leaves produce, a brittle, sharp crackle that is one of the defining sounds of winter hiking in the southern Appalachians. My breath was visible. Each exhalation produced a cloud of vapor that hung in the still, cold air for a moment before dissipating, the moisture from my lungs condensing in the 22-degree atmosphere with the efficiency that physics demands. My face was cold. My hands, in lightweight gloves, were cold. The tip of my nose was numb within the first half-mile. Normal December conditions for this elevation. Normal cold for a forest that has been losing heat to the shortening days since September, and that won't begin to warm again until March. About 3 miles in, approximately an hour and 15 minutes of steady hiking, the trail changed. The change was not gradual. It was not the progressive warming that occurs when you descend into a sheltered hollow where the cold air drains away. And the topography protects from wind. I've experienced that transition hundreds of times, and it follows a predictable pattern. A slow, incremental increase in temperature over a distance of maybe a quarter mile, the kind of change that you notice cumulatively rather than in a single moment. This was different. This was a step. One stride, I was in December. The next stride, I was not. The frozen ground became soft. Not soft in the way that mud is soft, yielding, and wet. Soft in the way that warm earth is soft. The ground temperature was high enough that the soil hadn't frozen, the surface giving slightly under my boot with the gentle compression that packed dirt produces when it's above 32 degrees and holding moisture in its liquid state. The frost on the leaf litter was gone, not melting, which would have produced a transitional zone of wet, wilting frost, gone. The leaves on the trail surface were dry and unfrosted. The same leaves that had been crunching under my boots with their brittle, ice-coated crackle a single step before. The air temperature rose. I felt it on my face first, the sudden absence of cold, the particular sensation of warmth arriving against skin that has been cold long enough to forget what warmth feels like. The change was dramatic. The air went from the low 20s to something that felt like the mid-60s in the space between one footfall and the next. My breath stopped being visible. The vapor that had been condensing with every exhalation simply stopped condensing. The ambient temperature rising above the dew point so abruptly that the transition was visible. In the last cloud of breath I exhaled, which formed in the cold air behind me, and hung there while I stood in warm air in front of it, the two temperature zones so close together that my exhaled breath occupied one while my body occupied the other. I stopped walking. I stood on the trail, and I processed what I was feeling. Warmth, ground warmth, rising through the soles of my boots with the steady, radiant energy of earth that is significantly above freezing. The warmth was coming from the ground, not from the air, which in a cold atmosphere would have required a heat source, a fire, a vent, a geothermal feature. From the ground itself, the trail surface radiates heat upward with the passive, sustained output of a surface that has been warm for a long time and that is maintaining its temperature through a process that I could not identify. I looked around. The forest within the warm zone was different. The change was as abrupt and as total as the temperature change. The understory, which had been the brown, dormant, leafless understory of a December forest for the entire hike, was green. Not the pale, struggling green of plants that are barely surviving. The deep, vital, saturated green of plants in full summer growth. Ferns were unfurled, the Christmas ferns and wood ferns that grow along the trails in the Pisgah, their fronds extended and photosynthesizing with the active metabolism that belongs to June. Moss was growing on the tree trunks and the rocks, with an intensity and a coverage that I associate with the wettest months of summer, the thick, vivid green that moss produces when moisture and warmth are both present in abundance. The leaf litter on the ground was decomposing at a rate that reflected warm weather biology, the leaves soft and dark and breaking down with the speed of organic matter in a warm, moist environment rather than the preserved, frozen-in-place state that December normally imposes. I looked up. The canopy above the warm section was bare. The trees, oak, hickory, and tulip poplar, had dropped their leaves the same way every other tree in the forest had dropped its leaves. The branches were bare and gray and winter naked. The warmth was not affecting the trees at the canopy level. It was affecting the ground, the understory, the soil, the surface plants, the moss, and the ferns are the components of the forest ecosystem that are closest to the earth and most responsive to ground temperature. The trees, whose roots were in the warm ground, but whose branches were in the cold air, were split between two seasons, their roots in summer and their crowns in winter, living in two climates simultaneously. I walked slowly through the warm section. It extended for about 200 feet, a corridor of warmth and green that ran along the trail in a strip roughly 10 feet wide, centered on the trail surface. The boundary between the warm zone and the cold zone was sharp, not a gradient, a line. I could stand with one foot in warmth and one in cold and feel the difference through my boots, the left foot on frozen ground and the right foot on warm ground, the two temperatures separated by maybe 6 inches of horizontal distance. The frost line, the edge where the frozen leaf litter met the unfrosted leaf litter, was as precise as if it had been drawn with a straight edge, a visible boundary that followed the edge of the warm zone, with a geometric regularity that nature does not typically produce. I walked the entire 200 feet. I stopped at the far boundary, the point where the warmth ended and the cold resumed. I put my hand on the ground. The earth on the warm side was warm, not hot, warm, maybe 65 degrees, the temperature of the soil in late spring. I moved my hand 6 inches to the right, across the boundary line. The earth on the cold side was frozen, 22 degrees. The difference under my palm was 43 degrees, across a distance of 6 inches. A temperature gradient so steep that no geological process I knew of could produce it, and no thermal anomaly I'd ever read about could explain it. I turned around and walked back through the warm section to the cold side. The warmth ended with the same abruptness it had begun, the cold air closing around me like water around a stone, the frost appearing on the leaf litter in front of me as if it had been waiting at the boundary for me to cross back. I looked behind me. The warm section was visible as a strip of green in the brown winter forest, a 200-foot corridor of summer in the middle of December, the ferns and the moss and the unfrosted ground forming a green band across the width of the trail that looked like a photograph from June pasted into a landscape from December. I took photographs. I recorded the GPS coordinates. I noted the temperature on my phone, which had a weather sensor that confirmed what my body was telling me. 64 degrees at the center of the warm section, 23 degrees at the boundary. I walked back through the section one more time, slowly, noting the details, the growth rate of the moss, the condition of the ferns, the softness of the soil, the absence of frost, the quality of the decomposition in the leaf litter. Everything was consistent with late spring or early summer. The biology within the warm section was operating on a seasonal schedule that was 6 months ahead of the forest around it. I hiked out, I drove to the ranger station, and I described what I'd found. The ranger on duty was a young woman who had been in the Pisgah for about 2 years. She listened politely and said she'd file a report and that someone would investigate. Her expression suggested she was filing the report for completeness, rather than because she expected the investigation to produce anything useful. I went back a week later. The trail was frozen. The entire trail, from the trailhead to the point where the warm section had been and beyond. 24 degrees. Frost on every leaf. The ground solid. The ferns are dormant, their fronds curled and brown. The moss is dull and dry. The warm section was gone. The 200 feet of summer that had been living in the middle of December was December now, cold and frozen and brown, indistinguishable from every other section of the trail. I've been back 4 times since, always in winter, always on cold days when the ground is frozen. N and the forest is dormant. T and the conditions are right, if right is the word, for whatever caused the warm section to appear. I've never found it again. The trail is consistently cold. The ground is consistently frozen. The forest is consistently December when December is what the calendar says. But I think about the boundary line, the 6 inches of horizontal distance across which the temperature changed by 43 degrees. The precision of that edge, the geometric regularity that separated the warm from the cold with a sharpness that looked engineered rather than natural. And I think about the ferns, unfurled and green and photosynthesizing in a world of frozen leaves and bare branches, growing as if June had never ended, as if the seasons that govern every other living thing in the Pisgah National Forest had been suspended within a 200-foot corridor of trail for reasons that the ground knows and the air doesn't, and the trees can't decide. E and the ferns don't question. And I wonder if the warm section is always there, not always visible, not always present in the way that December hikers can perceive, but always there, beneath the frozen surface, the way spring is always beneath winter, waiting for the conditions that will let it rise. And I wonder what those conditions are, and I wonder if the trail knows. And I wonder if the next time I hike that section in December, the frost will crack under my boots the way it always does, until the step when it doesn't. The step when the ground goes soft and the air goes warm and the ferns unfurl and the corridor opens. And I'm walking through June again, 200 feet of impossible summer in a forest that should be frozen, warm ground in a cold world, life in the middle of dormancy, the earth remembering a season it hasn't finished with, and refusing to let the calendar tell it otherwise. The Nantahala is the kind of forest that earns its name. The word is Cherokee, and it means land of the noonday sun, which sounds poetic until you understand the geography and realize it's a description, not a metaphor. The gorges and the hollows of the Nantahala are so deep and so narrow that the sun only reaches the bottom for a few hours around midday, the ridges on either side casting shadows that keep the creek bottoms in a permanent, green-tinged twilight for most of the daylight hours. It's a forest that feels submerged, the light filtering down through the canopy and the canyon walls the way light filters through water, the air, cool and damp, and carrying the particular mineral scent that granite and water and moss produce when they've been in proximity for millennia. I've been hiking the Nantahala for 6 years, since I moved to western North Carolina and discovered that the forest behind my house extended into a wilderness that felt less like a recreational resource and more like a remnant of the world that existed before recreation was invented. The trail I was hiking runs along Nantahala Creek, a stream that drains one of the deeper gorges in the district, and that provides, for about 4 miles, a trail experience that I've never found replicated anywhere else in the southern Appalachians. The trail follows the creek upstream through a corridor of old hemlock and rhododendron, the path narrow, the canopy low, the sound of the water constant, the light, the green-filtered half-light that gives the Nantahala its character. The creek is the trail's companion, running beside it within arm's reach for most of the route, the water clear and cold and moving with the steady, unhurried flow of a stream that has been cutting its channel through granite for longer than the trees have been growing on the banks. I was hiking on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2023. The weather was calm, the air still, the kind of autumn afternoon that the Nantahala produces when the summer humidity has broken and the fall clarity hasn't yet arrived, and the forest exists in a transitional state that feels suspended, neither one season nor the other, the light ambiguous and the temperature comfortable, and the forest holding its breath between what it was and what it's about to become. About 2 miles in, the trail passes a pool. Not a pool in the creek itself, which is moving too quickly in that section to produce still water. A separate pool, fed by a seep from the hillside, a place where groundwater emerges from beneath a moss-covered rock ledge and collects in a natural basin about 4 feet in diameter before overflowing into the creek through a narrow channel. The pool is shallow, maybe 18 inches deep, the bottom dark with the accumulated organic matter that settles in still water over time. The surface is still. perfectly, absolutely still, the water undisturbed by current or wind, the kind of natural mirror that the forest produces in sheltered places where the air doesn't move and the water doesn't flow, and the surface achieves a reflective quality that rivals manufactured glass. I glanced at the pool as I walked past. The glance was involuntary, the automatic, unconscious check that the human brain performs whenever it encounters a reflective surface. The quick visual confirmation that the world in the reflection matches the world you're standing in. A verification so routine and so habitual that you're not aware of performing it until the result is wrong. The result was wrong. My reflection was there, in the pool, on the still surface, visible with the clarity that still water provides in the green filtered light of the gorge. I could see myself, the shape and the proportions and the colors of my clothing and the position of my arms and the angle of my body. The reflection was me, but it was moving in the wrong direction. I was walking south, along the trail, following the creek upstream, moving south with the steady pace that I maintain on flat terrain. My reflection was walking north, not facing me, which is what a reflection should do, showing a mirror image of the person looking at it, the reversed left and right that is the fundamental property of reflected light. My reflection was showing my back, the back of my head, the back of my jacket, the back of my pack. The figure in the pool was me, seen from behind, walking away from me in the opposite direction with a stride that matched mine in speed and cadence, but that was oriented 180 degrees from the direction I was traveling. I stopped walking. The reflection didn't stop. The figure in the pool continued moving, walking north through the reflected forest with the steady, purposeful gait of a person who has somewhere to be and who is not interested in stopping, because the person whose reflection they're supposed to be has decided to stand still on a trail and stare into a pool. The reflection walked. I watched. The figure receded into the reflected landscape, moving away from me through reflected trees and reflected undergrowth and reflected trail that corresponded to the actual landscape behind me, but that was being traversed by a version of me that was going in a direction I was not going. The reflected forest was almost the same as the actual forest. Almost. The trees in the reflection were the trees behind me on the trail, the hemlocks and the rhododendron, and the granite boulders that lined the creek. But the light was different. The green filtered half-light of the gorge, which in the actual forest was ambient and diffuse, was in the reflected forest directional, coming from a point to the left of the trail that I couldn't identify, as if there was a light source in the reflected world that didn't exist in the actual one. The shadows in the reflection didn't match the shadows in the forest. They fell at different angles, in different directions, cast by a sun or a source that occupied a position in the reflected sky that the actual sky didn't contain. The reflection walked until it reached a bend in the trail, not a bend that existed in the actual trail behind me, a bend that existed only in the reflected landscape, a curve in the reflected path that took the figure to the right, around a reflected rock outcrop, and out of sight. The reflected version of me walked around a corner that the actual trail didn't have and disappeared. The pool went dark, not gradually, not the slow dimming that happens when a cloud passes over the sun and the light on a water surface changes. Instantly, the surface of the pool went from reflective to opaque in a single moment, the dark water absorbing whatever light had been reaching it and holding it below the surface, the way a closing eye absorbs light when the lid comes down. The pool was dark, the way a well is dark, the surface showing nothing, reflecting nothing, the water present but the mirror gone, as if the reflective property of the surface had been a temporary condition that had served its purpose and been withdrawn. I knelt beside the pool. I looked at the dark surface. My face should have been visible, the way any face is visible when you lean over still water and look down. But the water showed nothing. The surface was opaque, the dark organic layer on the bottom absorbing the light before it could bounce back. The pool transformed from a mirror to a void in the time it had taken my reflection to walk away and disappear around a corner that didn't exist. I put my hand in the water. It was cold. Mountain spring cold, the temperature of groundwater that has been in the earth long enough to reach thermal equilibrium with the bedrock, maybe 45 degrees. The water was clear when I disturbed it, my fingers visible beneath the surface. the dark color a product of the organic layer on the bottom rather than of the water itself. The pool was normal, a natural basin fed by a seep, shallow, cold, and unremarkable. Except that 3 minutes earlier, it had shown me a reflection of myself, walking in the wrong direction through a version of the forest that had a different light source, and a bend in the trail that didn't exist, and that reflection had walked away from me with the independence of a separate entity that shared my appearance, but not my intentions. I stood up. I looked at the trail behind me, the direction my reflection had been walking. The trail went north, back toward the trailhead, through the same hemlock and rhododendron corridor that I'd been hiking through all afternoon. There was no bend, no rock outcrop, no curve in the path that corresponded to the feature the reflection had walked around before disappearing. The trail was straight for about 200 yards, and then it curved gently to the left, following the creek. A curve that was in the wrong direction and at the wrong distance to match what I'd seen in the pool. I continued hiking south. I finished my planned route and turned around and hiked back north past the pool. I looked at it as I passed. The surface was still dark. No reflection. Not mine, not the trees, not the sky. The pool was holding its darkness with the patient opacity of a surface that has decided not to show what's beneath it. I've walked past the pool a dozen times since that afternoon. Each time I stop, I look at the surface. Each time the water is dark, opaque, unreflective. My face doesn't appear. The trees don't appear. The sky doesn't appear. The pool has not produced a reflection of any kind. Since the afternoon, my reflection walked away from me and disappeared around a corner in a forest that exists in the water and not on the land. I've thought about what I saw. I've tried to construct explanations that satisfy the rational framework that I prefer to operate within. An optical illusion produced by the angle of the light and the position of the dark bottom, and the particular way that still water can distort an image when the viewing angle, the surface tension, and the light source align in specific ways. I've tried to believe this. The explanation works until I remember the walking. Until I remember that my reflection was moving independently of me, walking in a direction I wasn't walking, continuing to move after I stopped, proceeding with a purpose that I didn't share toward a destination I couldn't see. Optical illusions don't walk away from you. Optical illusions don't turn corners. Optical illusions don't disappear around bends and trails that the actual landscape doesn't contain. My reflection is left. That's the simplest way I can say it. The figure in the pool that should have been a copy of me, bound to my position and my movements by the laws of optics that govern every reflective surface in the physical world, decided to go somewhere else. It turned around. It walked away. It followed a trail that exists in the reflected world and not in mine. And it went around a corner and it didn't come back. And the pool, having released the only reflection it was holding, went dark, as if the reflection was what had been giving the surface its reflective quality, as if the ability of the water to show an image was dependent on having an image to show. And now that the image has left, the water has nothing to reflect, and nothing to show. And the surface is dark and will stay dark until something returns to it that is willing to be seen. I wonder where my reflection went. I wonder what trail it's walking, in what version of the Nantahala, under what light source that casts shadows at angles that the actual sun doesn't produce. I wonder if it's still walking, if it reached whatever destination it was heading toward when it walked away from the pool and away from me. And I wonder if it looks like me. If whatever's walking a trail in a reflected forest in a world that exists on the other side of a 4-foot pool of spring water still has my face and my jacket and my stride, or if it's changed, if the act of leaving the reflection changed it into something else, something that no longer needs a person standing above a pool to exist, something that walks on its own, in its own forest, on its own trail, with a purpose that it discovered when it turned its back on the person it used to be a copy of and walked into a landscape that only the water can see. The Cherokee National Forest covers about 700,000 acres along the Tennessee side of the Appalachian Divide, a long, narrow strip of public land that runs from the Virginia border in the northeast to the Georgia border in the southwest, following the crest of the Unaka Mountains and the Great Smoky Escarpment through some of the most rugged and least visited terrain in the southern Appalachians. I've been hiking the Cherokee since I moved to Johnson City in 2019. drawn to it because it offers something that the more popular national parks and forests in the region don't, which is anonymity. Nobody knows you're in the Cherokee. Nobody is tracking your car at the trailhead or counting your footsteps on a managed path. You park at a pull-off on a forest road, and you walk into the trees. In the forest absorbs you the way water absorbs a stone, completely, without register. The trail I was hiking was unmaintained, which in the Cherokee means it exists on a map from the 1980s and hasn't been cleared or blazed since. The Forest Service maintains a network of trails in the Cherokee that it considers priority routes, the popular day hikes, the scenic loop, and the sections of long-distance trails that attract enough traffic to justify the expense of maintenance. Everything else is left to the forest and to the hikers who choose to walk paths that are slowly being reclaimed by the vegetation and the weather and the annual accumulation of deadfall that turns a clear trail into a suggestion, and then into a memory, and then into nothing. This particular trail ran along a creek in a drainage about 10 miles south of Irwin, a narrow valley between two ridges that the forest road accessed from the west. The trailhead, if you could call it that, was a wide spot on the forest road, where a culvert carried the creek beneath the roadbed, and a faint path descended the bank on the downstream side and followed the water into the trees. The trail was maybe 4 miles long, according to the old map, following the creek to its headwaters in a saddle between the ridges. I'd hiked it once before, about a year earlier, and found it passable but challenging, the tread obscured by leaves and deadfall. The blazes faded to ghosts on trees that had grown enough bark since the last painting to nearly absorb the marks. I hiked in on a Saturday morning in mid-November of 2023. The weather was cold and overcast, the temperature in the upper 30s, the kind of November morning that the Cherokee produces with the particular gray, heavy skied gravity that makes every ridge look like it's pressing down against the valley and every hollow look like it's filling with something denser than air. The creek was running low, the November drought reducing the flow to a trickle that threaded between the rocks and the exposed roots of the hemlocks that lined the banks. The trail followed the creek upstream on the left bank, the path barely visible beneath the leaf litter, the route determined more by the terrain than by any remaining trace of construction. About 2 miles in, I found the bridge. It was standing across the trail in a section of the drainage where the valley floor was flat and wide, maybe 100 feet across, the creek running through the center, and the trail paralleling it on the left bank about 30 feet from the water. The bridge was a standard Forest Service trail bridge, the kind of structure I've crossed hundreds of times in the southern Appalachians. Wooden plank deck, about 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, laid across 2 log stringers that spanned the width of whatever the bridge was intended to cross. The planks were pressure-treated lumber, the green-tinted wood that the Forest Service uses for structures that will be exposed to moisture. The stringers were peeled logs, maybe 10 inches in diameter, the bark removed, and the wood treated with the same preservative. The approaches were graded, the trail surface sloping up to meet the bridge deck on both sides with the smooth, intentional grade that construction crews build when they're installing a crossing structure. The bridge was in good condition, not new, but well maintained. The planks are solid, the stringers sound, the overall structure showing the kind of preservation that pressure-treated lumber achieves when it's been installed properly and hasn't been subjected to unusual stress. It looked like it had been there for maybe 10 or 15 years. The wood weathered to the gray-green patina that treated lumber develops over time, but still structurally sound, still performing the function it was designed to perform. Except it was performing the function over nothing. The bridge crossed dry ground, flat, packed dirt, the same trail surface that existed on both sides of the structure, continuous and unbroken, passing beneath the bridge without any interruption. No creek, no drainage, no depression, no erosion channel, no feature of any kind that would justify a crossing structure at this location. The ground beneath the bridge was level with the ground on either side, the trail surface running beneath the stringers with the uninterrupted continuity of terrain that has never been cut by water. I stopped and looked at the bridge the way you look at any object that is where it shouldn't be, with the focused, evaluative attention that anomaly produces in a mind accustomed to pattern. I walked to the edge of the bridge and looked at the approach. The grade was well built, the trail surface rising about 6 inches to meet the deck level, The transition smooth and intentional. The construction was professional. Somebody had surveyed this location, selected it for a bridge, graded the approaches, installed the stringers, and laid the planks with the skill and the equipment that Forest Service trail crews bring to infrastructure projects. They had done all of this at a point on the trail where there was nothing to cross. I walked under the bridge. The clearance was about 2 feet, enough to crawl beneath the structure on hands and knees, which I did, wanting to see the underside of the planks and the construction of the stringers. The underside was damp, not wet, not dripping, but damp. The wood showing the dark, moisture-saturated color that lumber acquires when it's been exposed to high humidity for a long time, the kind of dampness that the underside of a bridge develops when there's water beneath it, when the evaporation from a creek rises and condenses on the underside of the structure and keeps the wood perpetually moist. But there was no water. The ground beneath the bridge was dry, the same packed dirt as the trail, dry and firm, the surface showing no evidence of moisture, no mud, no dark coloring that wet soil produces, no standing water, no flowing water, no water at any point beneath the bridge or within 10 feet of it in any direction. The dampness on the underside of the planks had no source. It existed in contradiction to the conditions beneath it. Moisture without water, condensation without evaporation, dampness in a place where the physics of dampness required something that wasn't there. I crawled back out, stood up, and walked across the bridge. My footsteps on the planks made a sound, the hollow, resonant sound that wooden bridges produce when there's space beneath them, the particular acoustic quality that comes from a plank deck suspended over an open gap, the sound that tells your ears there's air below the surface you're walking on. The bridge sounded like a bridge over water. It rang with each footstep the way trail bridges ring when the creek is running beneath them, and the air gap between the water and the planks creates a resonant chamber that amplifies the impact of boots on wood. But the air gap was 2 feet of dry dirt. The resonance should have been dampened. The sound should have been dull, flat, the unremarkable thud of wood on packed earth. Instead, the bridge sang. Each footstep produced a tone that traveled through the stringers and into the ground, and that came back with the overtones and the sustain of a structure that was doing what it was designed to do, spanning water and carrying people across it. I stood on the bridge. And I looked down through the gaps between the planks. Dry ground, packed dirt, a few dead leaves. Nothing explained the dampness on the underside, or the resonance of the footsteps, or the reason someone had built a 12-foot bridge over a section of trail that was flat and dry and featureless. I hiked out. I drove home to Johnson City, and I thought about the bridge. And I didn't come to any conclusion. And the following Saturday, I drove back to the same forest road and parked at the same pull-off and hiked the same creek trail to the same point, approximately 2 miles from the trailhead. The bridge was gone. The trail was unbroken. The section of flat ground where the bridge had been standing was continuously packed dirt, the surface uniform, showing no post holes, no stringer impressions, no graded approaches, no evidence that a 12-foot wooden bridge had been standing there 7 days earlier. The trail passed through the location without interruption, as if the bridge had never existed, as if the structure I'd walked across and crawled under and listened to had been extracted from the landscape without leaving a trace of its presence. But the ground was wet. The section of trail where the bridge had been was saturated, the packed dirt dark with moisture, the surface soft and yielding under my boots, with the squish of ground that has been exposed to water for a long time. Not puddles, not standing water. Saturated soil, the kind of wetness that develops when a creek runs through a location, season after season, year after year. The water permeates the dirt and the substrate beneath it until the ground itself becomes a medium for water rather than a barrier to it. The wet section extended for about 12 feet, roughly the length of the bridge, and about 4 feet wide, roughly the width. The boundary between the wet ground and the dry ground was sharp, the same kind of precise geometric edge that I'd seen in other anomalies, a line drawn by something that didn't care about natural transitions. I knelt and touched the wet ground. The water that came up around my fingers was cold, creek cold. The temperature of water that has been flowing through the mountains and carrying the cold of the bedrock with it. I tasted it, the instinct of a person who has been drinking mountain water for years and who can tell the difference between groundwater and surface water by the mineral content. It tasted like the creek, the same creek that was running 30 feet to my right, the water that came off the ridge and gathered in the drainage. A noun had flowed downstream past the trailhead and into the river below. The water in the ground where the bridge had been was creek water, as if the creek had been flowing through this point on the trail at some time, if not now. I've been back to the location 3 more times. The bridge has not returned. The wet section persists, the ground dark and saturated, the water cold, the boundary sharp. A 12-foot strip of wet ground in the middle of a dry trail, marking the position of a bridge that was there and then wasn't. A bridge that crossed nothing and is gone, and that left behind the only evidence of its purpose, which was water. Water that wasn't there when the bridge was, and that appeared when the bridge disappeared. As if the bridge and the water couldn't exist at the same location at the same time. As if the bridge's purpose was to span a creek that is present only when the bridge isn't, and absent when the bridge is. A creek that flows through a section of trail on a schedule that I don't understand, and that the bridge was built to cross on a schedule that I understand even less. I think about the dampness on the underside of the planks. The moisture had no source in the dry ground beneath the bridge, and I think that maybe the dampness was the source. Maybe the water that saturates the ground now was present when the bridge was there, not beneath it, not visible, not flowing, but present in the wood, in the underside of the planks, held in the lumber the way a sponge holds water. The bridge carrying the creek in its structure rather than spanning it beneath its deck. A bridge that doesn't cross over water. A bridge that carries water within itself. The creek embedded in the wood, flowing through the grain, present in the dampness that my hands felt when I crawled beneath it and touched the underside of the planks. And when the bridge left, it left the water behind. Set it down on the ground where it had been holding it. Let the creek return to the surface that the bridge had been carrying it above. And the ground is wet now because the bridge put the water there when it left. And the bridge is gone because the water is here. And one day, the ground will dry and the bridge will come back, and the underside of the planks will be damp, and the creek will be in the wood, and the ground beneath will be dry, and the cycle will continue the way all cycles continue in. These mountains, the water and the wood and the trail and the bridge, all doing what they've been doing since before anyone built a path along this creek, and long after the path is gone, and the forest has reclaimed the ground, and the only thing left is the water flowing through the valley the way it always has. Sometimes in the creek and sometimes in the ground, and sometimes, for reasons that the mountains know and the maps don't, in the wood of a bridge that crosses nothing and spans everything and disappears when its work is done. I walk the same trail 3 times a week and have been walking it for 7 years. That's roughly 1,100 walks on the same path through the same section of the George Washington National Forest, a 4-mile out and back that starts at a parking area off a forest road about 6 miles west of Staunton, Virginia, and climbs through mixed hardwood to a ridgeline that provides a view of the Shenandoah Valley that I've seen in every season and every weather condition and every quality of light that the Blue Ridge produces. The walk takes about an hour and a half at my pace, which is moderate and unhurried, the pace of a person who is walking for the walking rather than for the destination. I go on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I've missed maybe 20 days in 7 years. The absence is distributed across illness, travel, and the occasional ice storm that makes the forest road impassable. The walk is not a recreation. It's maintenance. The thing I do to keep the internal machinery running in a way that the rest of my life, which is sedentary and solitary and conducted almost entirely in front of a screen, does not achieve. I know the trail. I know it with a specificity that goes beyond familiarity into something that I can only call intimacy. The kind of knowledge that develops when a person pays attention to the same landscape 3 times a week for 7 years. I know every tree on the first 2 miles. Not every species, though I know those too. Every individual tree. The tulip poplar at the half-mile mark, a massive specimen about 4 feet in diameter, with a lightning scar that runs from a branch about 40 feet up to the root flare at the base. The scar a pale, exposed strip of sapwood that the bark has never regrown. The twin oaks at the creek crossing, 2 red oaks that grew from the same root system or from acorns that fell within a foot of each other and that now stand side by side on the left bank of the creek, their trunks about 18 inches apart, their canopies merged into a single crown that arches over the crossing and provides shade in summer and a frame in winter. The hemlock at the 1 mile mark, a tree that was damaged in a wind event years before I started hiking and that has a bent trunk, the main stem curving at about the 15-foot mark into a horizontal position before turning upward again, creating a natural arch over the trail that I duck under out of habit, even though the clearance is at least 7 feet. These trees are my landmarks, my reference points, the fixed elements of a landscape that I navigate by position and by recognition, the way you navigate a house by the position of the furniture and the relationship of each room to the ones beside it. I know where these trees are the way I know where my kitchen table is, with a spatial certainty that doesn't require thought because the knowledge has been absorbed into the body through 1,000 repetitions. On a Monday morning in late April of 2024, I walked the trail, and the trees were different. I noticed the tulip poplar first, the tree with the lightning scar, the landmark at the half-mile mark, the 4-foot diameter giant that I've been walking past 3 times a week for 7 years. It was there, the same tree, the same lightning scar, the pale strip of exposed sapwood running from the branch to the root flare, the same diameter, the same bark pattern, the deep, interlocking furrows that tulip poplars develop in maturity, the same tree. But it wasn't at the half-mile mark. It was at the 3/4-mile mark, about a 1/4 mile further along the trail than it had been on Friday, the last time I'd hiked, when it had been at the half-mile mark, where it had always been. I stopped. I looked at the tree. I looked at the trail ahead and behind. I checked my position against the other landmarks I used to estimate distance. The drainage dip at about 1/3 of a mile, the rock outcrop at about 2/3. The drainage dip was behind me. The rock outcrop was ahead, but closer than it should have been if I weirs were at the half-mile mark. I was at the 3/4-mile mark, and the tulip poplar was beside me, its lightning scar bright in the morning light, as real and as present as it had been on every previous hike, in a position that was a 1/4 mile from where it should have been. I continued walking. The twin oaks at the creek crossing were there. The same trees, the same merged canopy, but they weren't together. They were on opposite sides of the trail. One on the left bank of the creek where they'd always been, and one on the right bank, about 15 feet apart, their canopies still showing the merged growth pattern that develops when 2 trees grow in proximity for decades. The branches reaching toward each other across the gap, the crown shaped by a closeness that the trunks no longer occupied. The trees had been separated. Or the trees had always been separate. E and I had always seen them together. Or the trees were in the positions they'd always been in, and my memory of their positions was wrong, and had been wrong for 7 years. The hemlock with the bent trunk was 200 yards from its usual position. The same tree, the same bend in the trunk, the horizontal curve at 15 feet, the arch over the trail. But the trail it was arching over was a section of trail that it had never been near, a point about 200 yards south of the 1-mile mark, where I'd been ducking under it since 2017. The hemlock was in the forest, the way a couch is in a room, present and recognizable and utterly wrong in its placement. Like walking into your living room and finding the couch against the wrong wall. The same couch, the same fabric, the same cushions, but in a position that your spatial memory rejects because the couch belongs somewhere else. Every tree I knew was present. Every tree I knew was in a different position. The forest had the same inventory but a different layout. The same pieces arranged in a different configuration, as if someone or something had disassembled the first 2 miles of trail during the weekend and reassembled them, using all the same components but a different plan. The trees were there, the trail was there, the terrain was there, the creek was there. Everything that constituted the physical landscape of my daily walk was accounted for. Nothing was missing. Nothing was added. The forest was complete. It was just arranged differently. I passed 3 other hikers that morning. A man with a dog is going uphill, and a couple is coming down. I watched them. I watched their faces as they walked through the rearranged forest, looking for the signs of confusion or disorientation that I was feeling. The The subtle facial expressions that people produce when something in their environment doesn't match their expectations. The man with the dog walked past the tulip poplar at the 3/4 mile mark without glancing at it. The couple walked through the separated twin oaks at the creek crossing without pausing. Nobody showed any sign of noticing that the forest was different. They walked through it with the casual, unfocused attention of people who are enjoying a hike and not memorizing the position of individual trees. The forest was the background to them, scenery. The green and brown and gray of a typical spring morning in the George Washington, unremarkable and unexamined. Maybe for them it hadn't changed. Maybe the forest was exactly what it had always been for a person who walks it once or twice a year and doesn't know the tulip poplar from the hemlock or the twin oaks from any other pair of trees that happened to grow near a creek. Crossing. Maybe the rearrangement was visible only to someone who had been paying attention to the same trees 3 times a week for 7 years. Someone who had memorized the position of individual specimens the way a musician memorizes the position of notes on an instrument, with a precision that makes any deviation immediately, viscerally apparent. I went home. I sat at my desk, and I pulled up the photographs I'd taken of the trail over the years. Casual images that I'd shot on my phone and stored without organization in the cloud. Hundreds of photographs of the same trail in every season, many of them including the landmark trees that I used as reference points. The tulip poplar at the half-mile mark, the twin oaks together at the creek crossing, the hemlock at the 1-mile mark. The photographs confirmed what my memory was telling me. The trees had been in different positions. The positions I remembered, the positions that 7 years of 3 times weekly observation had established in my spatial memory with a certainty that I would have trusted over any instrument, were confirmed by photographs that showed the same trees in the same positions that I remembered them being in. The tulip poplar was at the half-mile mark. The twin oaks were together. The hemlock was at the 1-mile mark. I went back on Wednesday. The trees were still in their new positions. The tulip poplar at the 3/4 mile mark. The twin oaks separated. The hemlock was displaced by 200 yards. The rearrangement was persistent, not a one-day anomaly, not a hallucination that corrected itself with sleep and perspective. The forest was in its new configuration, and it stayed there. It's been in the new configuration for a year now. I've walked the trail roughly 150 times since the morning I noticed the change, and the trees have not moved back. The tulip poplar is at the 3/4 mile mark. The twin oaks are on opposite sides of the creek. The hemlock is 200 yards south of where it stood for at least 7 years. The forest has settled into its new arrangement with the same permanence that it occupied its old arrangement. The trees growing and leafing and dropping their leaves in the same seasonal cycles, performing all the functions of living trees in positions that my photographs prove are not the positions they were in before April of 2024. I've stopped showing people the photographs. The conversation that follows is always the same. Memory is unreliable. Photographs can be misleading. You probably just weren't paying as close attention as you thought you were. The reasonable explanations that reasonable people provide when someone tells them that the trees in a forest moved overnight, and that the evidence supports the claim, and that nobody else noticed because nobody else was looking. Nobody else was looking. That's the part that I can't stop thinking about. A forest rearranged itself. The individual trees changing positions like furniture in a room that someone redecorated while the occupants were asleep, and nobody noticed except the person who knew where every piece of furniture was supposed to be. Maybe the forest moves all the time. Maybe the trees shift and migrate and trade positions with a frequency that the casual observer never detects, because the casual observer doesn't know where the trees were yesterday, and therefore can't determine that they're somewhere else today. Maybe the forest is fluid, and the landscape I walk through 3 times a week is not a fixed arrangement of permanent objects, but a dynamic, shifting system that reorganizes itself according to principles that I don't understand, and that nobody has proposed because nobody watches closely enough to see the movement. Nobody watches the way I watch. 3 times a week, for 7 years, counting trees, noting positions, building a map of individual specimens that is precise enough to detect a 1/4 mile displacement in a tulip poplar that everyone else walks past without seeing. Maybe the forest counted on that. Maybe the forest moves because it can, because nobody is watching closely enough to notice, because the trees know that the people who walk among them are looking at the trail and the sky and their phones, and not at the specific position of a specific oak relative to a specific creek crossing. And maybe the forest made a mistake. Maybe it moved on a weekend when it assumed nobody would notice, and it forgot about the man who walks the trail 3 times a week and who knows every tree the way he knows his own furniture. Maybe the forest got caught, and now it's staying in its new arrangement, because going back would confirm what moving forward has already revealed, which is that the trees are not where they're supposed to be. E and the forest knows it, T and I know it, T and nobody else does. And the forest is waiting for me to stop watching. To miss enough days that my memory of the old positions fades. S and the new positions become the only ones I know. And when that happens, when the old map in my head has been overwritten by the new one, the forest will move again. Because that's what forests do. They move. They've always moved. And the only thing that keeps them still is someone watching. I section hike the Appalachian Trail when I can get 3 or 4 days away from work, which happens about twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. I'm not a through hiker. I don't have the time or the temperament for the 6-month commitment that walking from Georgia to Maine requires. I'm a weekend warrior with occasional delusions of grandeur, a 41-year-old accountant from Roanoke who puts on a pack and walks the trail in pieces, collecting sections the way some people collect stamps, methodically, without urgency, with the understanding that I'll finish the trail eventually or I won't. And either outcome is acceptable because the walking is the point, not the completion. The section I was hiking was in Southwest Virginia, a 3-day stretch from Partnership Shelter near Marion to the Damascus Trailhead, about 40 miles of trail that crosses some of the highest terrain on the AT in Virginia, the ridgelines of the Iron Mountains and the Mount Rogers Highlands, where the trail climbs above 5,000 feet, and the spruce fir forest gives the landscape a character that feels more like New England than the mid-Atlantic. I'd been planning the hike for months, arranging the logistics of car placement and resupply, and the particular kind of scheduling that section hiking requires. The coordination of a starting point and an ending point that are 40 miles apart and that require 2 vehicles or a shuttle service or a very understanding friend to manage. I started walking on a Thursday morning in late October, the weather clear and cold, the temperature in the high 30s at the trailhead, the kind of fall morning that the Virginia Highlands produce, with a clarity that makes every view look like a photograph and every breath feel like a drink of water. The pack was comfortable, about 30 pounds with food and water for 3 days. The weight distributed well enough that I could maintain my usual pace without significant discomfort. The trail was well maintained, the white blazes fresh, the tread clear of the deadfall and erosion that accumulate during the off-season. Good conditions, good trail, the kind of hiking that makes you wonder why you spend the other 362 days of the year doing anything else. The whispers started around noon on the first day. I'd been hiking for about 4 hours, climbing through the transition zone between the hardwood of the lower elevations and the spruce fir of the highlands. The trail gaining elevation with the steady, grinding ascent that the AT specializes in, long climbs that test the legs and the lungs and the patience in roughly equal measure. I was in a section of spruce forest, the trail narrow, the canopy low, the characteristic green-dark tunnel that spruce creates when the trees grow close together, and the lower branches persist in the reduced light. The forest was quiet. Spruce forests are quieter than hardwood forests, the dense foliage absorbing sound the way carpet absorbs footsteps. The acoustic environment is disengaged and muffled, and close. I heard the whispers the way you hear anything that's below the threshold of normal attention, as a texture in the silence rather than a sound in its own right. The sibilance registered before the recognition, the SSH and hiss quality of speech at its lowest possible volume, produced by a mouth that was shaping consonants and vowels, but withholding the breath that would give them audibility. Whispers, the specific, recognizable sound of a human voice, speaking at a volume deliberately chosen to prevent the listener from hearing the words. Not quite speech, which is speech reduced in volume, but still intelligible. Whispers, which are speech reduced to structure, the architecture of language without the content, the shape of words without the substance. They were ahead of me. on the trail, maybe 50 yards in front of my position, moving in the same direction and at the same pace as my own movement. I heard them in the spruce tunnel, the way you hear someone talking in the next room, the sound reaching me through the trees and the undergrowth with enough clarity to confirm its existence and not enough to determine its content. Words were being spoken. I could hear the cadence, the rhythm of speech, the rise and fall of a voice, following the natural melody that human language produces when it's being spoken with intent. But I couldn't hear the words. The whispers were below the threshold where consonants resolve, and vowels differentiate, and meaning assembles from the raw material of sound into the finished product of language. I stopped walking. The whispers stopped. Not immediately. A beat after, the way sound stops when a person who has been talking realizes that the person they're talking to has stopped moving and that the conversation should pause until movement resumes. A beat. Maybe half a second. A delay that was short enough to be coincidental and long enough to be responsive. I started walking. The whispers started. Same delay. Half a second. The sound resumed as my feet resumed. The connection between my movement and the whispers established with the consistency of a cause and an effect. I walked. The whispers whispered. I stopped. The whispers stopped. The correlation was reliable enough to test, and I tested it 4 or 5 times, starting and stopping at irregular intervals, noting each time the brief delay between my movement and the sound, the half-second gap that suggested the whispers were responding to me rather than coinciding with me. I tried to close the distance. I jogged a section of flat trail, the pack bouncing on my hips, my boots hitting the tread with the accelerated rhythm that running produces. The whispers maintained their distance. They moved faster when I moved faster, the sound staying 50 yards ahead. The gap between us as constant as if it were being measured and maintained by something that knew exactly how far 50 yards was and intended to keep it that way. I slowed. The whispers slowed. I stopped. The whispers stopped. The distance was fixed. Whatever was ahead of me on the trail was maintaining a separation that it had chosen and that my speed couldn't modify. I hiked the rest of the first day with the whispers ahead of me. They were constant, present whenever I was moving, absent whenever I stopped. The faithful acoustic companion of a hiker who had not asked for company and who could not close the gap or identify the source. The whispers had no direction in the sense that a person speaking would have a direction, facing toward me or away, the sound shaped by the orientation of the mouth that produced it. The whispers were omnidirectional, present in the air ahead of me the way fog is present, diffuse and sourceless, occupying the space in front of me without emanating from a point within it. I reached the shelter where I'd planned to camp around 5 in the afternoon. The shelter was a standard AT 3-sided structure. Log construction, metal roof, sleeping platform, the kind of backcountry accommodation that the trail provides at intervals of approximately 10 miles throughout its length. I was alone. No other hikers at the shelter, no packs on the platform, no fire in the ring. I set up my sleeping pad and bag on the platform and cooked dinner on my stove and ate sitting on the edge of the platform with my feet hanging off and the forest darkening around me and the whispers gone. Silent since I'd stopped walking and set up camp. They came back around 8. I was in my sleeping bag, reading by headlamp, the shelter dark around me, the forest producing the layered nighttime sounds that mountain forests produce at elevation, wind, insects, and the distant call of an owl. The whispers started outside the shelter, on the trail, moving past my position with the same steady, measured pace they'd maintained all day. Past me, not stopping at the shelter. Continuing south on the trail, in the direction I would hike the following morning. The sound receded with distance, the way any sound recedes, growing fainter with each yard of separation until the whispers were at the edge of audibility and then beyond it. They stopped. About 50 yards down the trail from the shelter, the sound ceased with the same abrupt termination that it exhibited when I stopped walking, the half-second delay, the brief persistence, the silence. The whispers stopped 50 yards ahead of where I lay in the shelter, at approximately the position I would occupy when I began hiking the next morning, and the gap between us was re-established at the distance it had maintained all day. The forest was quiet after that. Normal quiet. The wind and the owl and the insects and the particular silence that occupies the spaces between natural sounds. I lay in my sleeping G, and I listened to the absence of whispering. G, and I thought about what I'd been hearing for the last 8 hours. S, and I didn't sleep well. In the morning, G, the whispers were there. I packed the shelter and shouldered my pack and took my first step south on the trail. L and the whispers were already going, already ahead of me, already 50 yards down the trail, already producing the sibilant, breathy cadence that I'd been listening to since noon the day before. They hadn't waited for me to start walking. They were already walking, already whispering, already moving in the direction I was heading, with the confidence of something that knew my route and was traveling it ahead of me, scouting or clearing or preparing the trail for my arrival, with a purpose that the whispers carried but that I couldn't decode. The second day was the same as the first. Whispers ahead, 50 yards, constant when I moved, silent when I stopped, faster when I ran, slower when I slowed. The gap maintained with a precision that never varied by more than a few feet, as if whatever was ahead of me was tethered to my position by an invisible line that stretched to exactly 50 yards and no further. I tried talking to them. On a section of trail that was flat and straight enough that I could see 50 yards ahead, I called out, "Hello, who's there? Can you hear me?" The trail ahead was empty. No figure, no shadow, no movement. The whispers continued without change, unaffected by my voice, unresponsive to my words, as indifferent to my attempt at communication as the wind is indifferent to a shout. They were not talking to me. They were talking ahead of me. The whispers were pointed forward, directed at the trail in front of them, addressed to something further along the path that I couldn't see, and that they were approaching with each step while maintaining their distance from me. The second night was like the first. The whispers passed the shelter around 8, continued 50 yards down the trail, and stopped. The forest went quiet. I slept, or approximated sleep, the shallow, vigilant rest that the body permits when the mind has classified the environment as uncertain. The third day, the last day, the section ending at Damascus, the trail descending from the highlands through hardwood forest to the small town on the edge of the national forest, where my car was parked and where the hike would end. The whispers accompanied me down, maintaining the gap, maintaining the pace, the familiar sibilance filling the air ahead of me with the steady, purposeful cadence that I'd been hearing for 3 days. About 100 yards from the trailhead, the whispers stopped, not with the half-second delay that my stopping produced. Abruptly, completely, the sound that had been 50 yards ahead of me for 40 miles in 3 days ceased as if it had hit a wall. The silence that replaced it was the particular silence of a sound that has been present long enough that its absence is louder than its presence, the ringing, charged quiet that your ears produce when a noise they've been filtering suddenly stops. S in the brain needs a moment to recalibrate the acoustic baseline. I walked the last 100 yards in silence, normal silence. The kind of silence that exists when nobody is whispering ahead of you on a trail, when the forest is just a forest and the air is just air and the sounds are the sounds that they should be, wind and birds, and the distant hum of a town that exists beyond the tree line. I reached the parking lot. My car was where I'd left it. The trailhead sign was where it had always been. Everything was normal. I stood at the edge of the low T, and I looked back at the trail. The forest was quiet. The section of trail that disappeared into the trees showed nothing. No movement, no sound, no whisper. Whatever had been ahead of me for 3 days had stopped at the boundary between the trail and the town and had not crossed it. The trailhead was a line. The forest was on one side, and the parking lot was on the other, and whatever was whispering my route had reached the line and stopped. I've hiked other sections of the AT since then. The whispers have not returned. Whatever was ahead of me on that section of trail in Southwest Virginia was specific to that place and that time, a 3-day accompaniment that began when I entered the highlands and ended when I left them, and that is not repeated on any subsequent hike, in any subsequent location. But I think about the whispers at night, the sibilant, breathy cadence that was always 50 yards ahead, always moving, always whispering words I couldn't hear to something I couldn't see. And I wonder what the words were, and I wonder who they were addressed to, and I wonder if the whispers were a warning, something moving ahead of me on the trail to tell the forest I was coming. the way a scout moves ahead of a column to prepare the terrain for what follows. Or if the whispers were an invitation, something calling from 50 yards ahead to whatever lay beyond it, drawing something toward me from further along the trail, whispering, "Come and see," to something in the forest that was listening with an attention I couldn't perceive. And I wonder which it was. And I wonder if the reason the whispers stopped at the trailhead was that the thing they were calling had arrived and was standing at the edge of the parking lot and was watching me get in my car and drive away, already too close for whispering, already close enough that words weren't necessary, already there. I volunteer with a trail maintenance crew on the Blue Ridge Parkway 2 weekends a month from April through October. The work is physical and satisfying and largely anonymous, the kind of labor that produces results that thousands of people enjoy without ever thinking about the hands that produce them. Trail maintenance is drainage and tread and vegetation management, the ongoing battle against water and gravity, and the biological determination of every plant within reach of the trail corridor to reclaim the space that humans have cleared. We dig water bars, de-check dams, and turnpikes. We cut back rhododendron and laurel. We rebuild sections of tread that erosion has worn down to the rocks and roots beneath. We do this with hand tools, McLeod's and Pulaskis, Essen rock bars and grub hose, the same tools that trail crews have been using since the Civilian Conservation Corps built the first trails in these mountains in the 1930s. The work hasn't changed much in 90 years. The tools haven't changed much either. The technique is the same. The physical relationship between a person and a tool and a section of earth that needs to be shaped remains fundamentally the same, regardless of the decade. Our crew is 5 people, all volunteers, coordinated by a crew leader named Hank, who has been maintaining trails on the parkway for 22 years and who possesses the particular authority that sustained competence produces. The quiet confidence of a person who has done one thing well for long enough that the doing has become the defining feature of who they are. Hank is in his 60s, retired from the Postal Service, and he approaches trail work with the same systematic, route-based discipline that 30 years of mail delivery apparently instills. He has a work order for every outing, a documented list of tasks and locations provided by the Parkway's trail coordinator, and he follows the work order with a fidelity that tolerates no improvisation. The outing was a Saturday in mid-September of 2023. The work order assigned us to a section of trail about 4 miles south of Craggy Gardens, a moderate hiking trail that descends from the parkway through mixed hardwood to a creek crossing, and then climbs back to the parkway at a different point, forming a loop that the parkway maintains as one of its showcased day hike options. Our tasks were drainage maintenance and tread repair on the descending section, the kind of routine work that the September rains make necessary every year when the runoff carves channels in the trail surface and undermines the water bars that keep the water from following the path of the trail rather than crossing it. We parked at the upper trailhead around 8 in the morning and hiked in with our tools, 5 people carrying the McLeod's and Pulaskis and rock bars and grub hose that the work required, the tools balanced on shoulders or gripped in fists, the weight familiar and comfortable in hands that had been carrying them for years. The morning was overcast and cool, the temperature in the low 50s, the kind of September morning that the parkway produces at elevation, the air damp with the remnants of overnight fog, the forest still holding the dark, wet quality that precedes the moment when the sun gets high enough to burn through the clouds and convert the morning from gray to gold. We worked the first section of the descending trail for about 3 hours, clearing drainage structures and rebuilding tread where the August rains had eroded the surface down to bedrock. The work was routine and rhythmic, the sound of tools on earth and rock filling the forest with the percussive, organic noise that trail maintenance produces, the scrape of a McLeod's twan, the thunk of a Pulaski biting into a root, the ring of a rock bar prying a stone from its bed. We worked in the particular silence that experienced crews develop, the communication reduced to gestures and glances because the work has been done so many times that verbal coordination is redundant. Around 11, we took a break and then moved further down the trail to the next section on the work order, about 2 miles ahead of our morning position, toward the creek crossing at the bottom of the loop. We hiked at a moderate pace, tools on our shoulders, the trail descending through the hardwood with the gentle grade that parkway trails are designed to maintain. We heard them before we saw them. About a quarter-mile ahead, around a curve in the trail that the terrain hid from our view, the sounds of a trail crew working, the scrape of a McLeod, the thunk of a Pulaski, the ring of a rock bar. The sounds were unmistakable to anyone who has spent time on a trail crew, the specific acoustic signatures of specific tools performing specific tasks, as recognizable to a trail worker as the sound of a typewriter is to a secretary, or the sound of a cash register is to a clerk. Someone was doing trail work ahead of us on a section of trail that, according to our work order, was not scheduled for maintenance. Hank frowned. He looked at the work order on his clipboard. The section ahead of us was not on the list. No work was scheduled for the creek crossing or the ascending section of the loop. The only crew authorized to work this trail today was ours. He said maybe the coordinator double-booked. It happens occasionally. 2 crews assigned to overlapping sections due to a scheduling error, producing the mild annoyance of duplicated effort and the waste of volunteer time that results when 2 groups arrive to do the same job. We rounded the curve. The crew was about 50 yards ahead, on a section of trail that flattened briefly before continuing its descent. 4 people, working, their backs to us, their bodies bent to the tasks, their tools moving with the rhythmic mechanical efficiency of experienced trail workers performing maintenance that they've performed 1,000 times. They were clearing drainage and rebuilding tread, exactly the kind of work that our crew does, the same tasks with the same tools, in the same postures, on the same kind of terrain. Hank called out, a standard greeting, the hey there that trail crews exchange when they encounter each other, the casual, friendly acknowledgement that another group is on the trail and that coordination might be needed. The crew ahead didn't respond. They continued working, their tools rising and falling with the unbroken rhythm that the tasks sustained, the McLeod scraping, the Pulaski thunking, the rock bar ringing. No heads turned, no voices answered. The 4 workers continued as if we hadn't spoken, as if we weren't there, as if the section of trail they occupied existed in a space that our voices couldn't reach. We walked closer. Hank was in front, the rest of us following at the spacing that a trail crew maintains when moving as a group, about 10 feet between each person, the tools on our shoulders or in our hands. The sounds of the other crew's work grew louder as we approached, the acoustic detail increasing with proximity, the individual character of each tool strike becoming distinguishable. I could hear the specific scrape pattern of the McLeod, the quick forward push, and the slower drag back that the tool produces when a skilled user is smoothing a surface. I could hear the specific impact of the Pulaski, the solid woody thunk that the axe side produces when it cuts a root, and the duller, earthier sound that the grub side produces when it breaks soil. These were real tools doing real work on real ground. We were about 20 feet away when Hank stopped. He didn't say stop, he stopped. And the rest of us stopped because his body language communicated something that his voice hadn't, a rigidity in his posture that I'd never seen in 22 years of trail work, a tension that entered his shoulders and his arms, and traveled down to his hands where they tightened on the handle of his McLeod. He said something's wrong. He said it quietly, to himself more than to us, the verbalization of a recognition that was still forming. I looked at the crew ahead of us, really looked with the focused, evaluative attention that Hank's warning demanded. The workers were wearing cotton, heavy cotton canvas pants and denim shirts, the kind of work clothes that were standard for outdoor labor in the mid-20th century and that haven't been worn by trail crews in at least 30 years. Modern crews wear synthetic fabrics, moisture-wicking polyester and nylon blends that dry quickly and regulate temperature. Nobody wears cotton in the backcountry anymore. Cotton is cold when wet and heavy when saturated, and potentially dangerous in the kind of weather that mountains produce without warning. Cotton kills is a phrase that every backcountry worker learns in their first season. These workers were wearing cotton, not as a fashion choice, as a uniform. The standard issue work clothes of a crew that had been outfitted before synthetic fabrics existed. Their tools were old. The handles were darkened with decades of use, the wood stained with the oil from 1,000 hands, the surfaces worn smooth by the friction of grip and work, and the particular polish that hardwood develops when it's been held and swung and carried for years beyond its expected service life. The metal heads were worn, the cutting edges of the Pulaskis honed to a shape that reflected years of sharpening, the profile narrower and more concave than a new tool, the metal thinned by the cumulative removal of material that each sharpening produces. These tools had been in use for a very long time, and they were building a trail that didn't exist. The tread they were constructing, the section of ground they were clearing, grading, and shaping with their old tools and their cotton clothes, didn't connect to the trail we were standing on. The work was angled away from our trail, heading into the forest at about 30 degrees. The new tread cutting through undergrowth and around trees toward a section of the mountain that had no trail, no maintained route, no destination that the parkway's trail system recognized. They were building a trail into the forest, a trail that went somewhere that the current trail system didn't go. I looked at the nearest worker. The one closest to our position, about 15 feet away, is working with a McLeod, the tool scraping the ground with the steady, rhythmic efficiency of a person who doesn't need to think about what they're doing because the body has memorized the motion and performs it without conscious direction. The worker's back was to me. I could see the cotton shirt, the denim pants, the work boots that were leather, not the synthetic hiking boots that modern crews wear. I could see the hands on the tool handle, the grip comfortable and practiced, the fingers positioned with the specific placement that experienced McLeod users develop, the dominant hand high on the handle, the guide hand low, the wrists angled to produce the forward push stroke that shapes a trail surface. I could not see the worker's face. None of the 4 workers had turned to face us. None had looked up from their work. None had acknowledged our presence or our voices in any way. They worked with their backs to us, their tools moving, their bodies bent to the task, their attention directed at the section of ground they were shaping with a focus that excluded everything else, including the 5 people standing 20 feet behind them watching. Hank turned us around. He didn't explain. He turned and walked back up the trail, and we followed, and nobody argued because the expression on Hank's face was the expression of a man who has seen something he recognizes and that the recognition has told him to leave. We hiked back to the vehicles in about 40 minutes, faster than we'd come in, the pace set by Hank's long, urgent stride. At the truck, he radioed the parkway office. He asked for the trail coordinator. He described what we'd found. 4 workers on the trail, cotton work clothes, old tools, building tread in a direction that didn't connect to any maintained trail. The coordinator checked the schedule. No crew was authorized to work that section. No crew had been dispatched. No volunteer group had registered to work on the parkway that day other than ours. The coordinator said she'd send someone to check. She said it with the tone that bureaucrats use when they're following procedure without expectation that the procedure will produce results. Hank said Finn, D signed off, sat in the truck, and didn't start the engine for a long time. I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me with the evaluative, deciding gaze of a man who is choosing how much to share. Then he said the trail they were building goes to Rattlesnake Lodge. Rattlesnake Lodge was a resort hotel that existed on the mountain from the 1900s to the 1920s, a luxury retreat for wealthy visitors that was accessed by a trail system that no longer exists. The lodge burned in 1926. The trails that served it were abandoned and reclaimed by the forest. The parkway was built in the 1930s on a different alignment, and the modern trail system that we maintain has no connection to the trails that once led to the lodge. Hank said the crew we'd seen was building one of the old trails. The trail that connected the lodge to the lower elevation was the path that guests, staff, and supply teams had used for the 20-odd years that the lodge operated. A trail that had been abandoned for 100 years, and that the forest had erased from the landscape decades before the parkway was built and the modern trails were established. He said the work order they were following was 100 years old. He said the tools were right for the era. The clothes were right for the era. The construction technique, which he'd recognized from historical photographs, was right for the era. He said they were building a trail to a lodge that burned in 1926, working from a plan that was drawn up before any of us were born, using tools that should be in a museum and wearing clothes that should be in an archive. And they were doing it with the quiet, efficient, uncommunicative focus of a crew that has a job to do and intends to finish it regardless of who is watching. And even though the destination they're building toward has been ashes for a century. The parkway sent a ranger to check the site the following Monday. The section of the trail where the crew had been working was undisturbed. No new thread, no cleared drainage, no tool marks in the soil. The undergrowth where the new trail had been heading was intact, the vegetation unbroken, the forest floor showing no evidence that anyone had been cutting or grading or shaping the ground. The crew was gone, and the trail they'd been building was gone, and the only evidence that either had existed was the sound that 5 volunteers had heard from a quarter-mile away, and the sight that 5 pairs of eyes had seen from 20 feet, and the memory that 5 minds now carried of 4 workers in cotton clothes, with old tools, building a trail to a place that burned before any of us were born. Still working, still building, still following a work order that nobody alive had issued. Still maintaining a trail system that the forest erased and that the workers, apparently, have never stopped constructing.